Shield walls often take center stage in modern films about medieval warfare. They're dramatic, visually intense, and usually serve as the backdrop for acts of heroism. But if you take a closer look at how these formations actually worked, you'll find that what Hollywood portrays is a far cry from historical reality. Rather than flashy individual combat, real shield wall fighting was methodical, physically exhausting, and relied on collective discipline more than individual skill. In cinema, battles are often climactic moments where a hero shines, leaping into danger, swinging wildly, and defeating waves of enemies. While entertaining, this kind of choreography has little to do with how medieval soldiers truly fought. Filmmakers often prioritize visual impact over historical accuracy, but shield walls, although sometimes debated by historians, are well documented enough that we can confidently address common misconceptions. In this video, we'll break down 4 widely held myths about medieval shield walls and replace them with a historically grounded understanding of how they actually functioned in battle. Myth 1: shield wall combat was chaotic and individualistic. Contrary to popular depictions, medieval battles, especially those involving shield walls, were not swirling masses of individual fighters engaging in wild, uncoordinated combat. In large-scale, organized engagements, order was everything. A warrior who fought like Uhtred from the Last Kingdom, dodging, flanking, and fighting independently, would have been quickly overwhelmed or killed. The reality was that most foot soldiers weren't highly trained or uniquely brave. Their best chance of survival and of contributing to the fight was to stick closely to the formation. Maintaining tight ranks was essential. Take the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The Anglo-Saxon forces on Senlac Hill formed a dense line, described as an impenetrable body by contemporary sources, by locking their shields together. Historian Clifford Rogers explains that formations like these are what medieval writers meant when they described a shield wall, though the exact tactics and structure varied depending on the time and region. Shield walls weren't rigid formulas. They adapted based on terrain, troop type, and the nature of the engagement. For example, during fast-paced Viking raids, shield walls were less practical. But in large open-field battles, the formation's strength came from its density and coordination. When soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, they protected one another's flanks and were harder to break. In some cases, heavily armed fighters were placed in front to absorb cavalry charges, but even then the key element was always cohesion. Christine de Pizan, a French philosopher and writer from the late medieval period, emphasized the importance of formations being tight and consistent, like a wall. Jean de Bueil, a French commander during the 100 Years' War, even said that soldiers should be packed so tightly that not even an apple could pass between them. A shield wall's strength lay in its unity. As long as the line held, the soldiers could resist attacks and survive longer. If it fractured, however, chaos followed, and with it, defeat. Shield walls were rarely broken mid-battle unless to retreat or pursue a fleeing enemy. There simply wasn't room for individual flair or wild swordplay. Myth 2: shield walls charged like in the movies. Audiences loved the sight of 2 armies crashing into each other at full speed. But in actual medieval warfare, charging straight into a solid shield wall was a disaster waiting to happen. Unless the enemy's line was already disrupted, such a maneuver was suicidal. Running disrupted your own formation and left soldiers exposed. The need to move quickly meant fighters couldn't stay locked together, and even something as minor as uneven terrain could split ranks. Jean de Bueil warned that a foot formation should avoid advancing at speed. Moving forward tended to break ranks, especially when obstacles like bushes or ditches were involved. He wrote, "A force that moves before another force is defeated, unless God grants it grace." This means that a full-speed charge was both tactically unsound and historically unrealistic. Shield walls were primarily defensive arrangements. They were strongest when they held their ground. That said, engagement did eventually require movement. If a shield wall needed to advance, they might do so slowly, step by step, keeping ranks tightly closed. Alternatively, they could perform a shock advance, breaking formation briefly to run forward, then reforming the wall just before clashing with the enemy. This second tactic may have been used by the Norman infantry during their initial push up Senlac Hill at Hastings. However, they were at a disadvantage. They had to run uphill while the Anglo-Saxons rained projectiles down on them. By the time they reached the top, their line was riddled with gaps and no longer effective as a unified shield wall. So, whether advancing slowly or charging in bursts, movement put a shield wall at risk. The safest and most effective tactic was almost always to hold firm and wait for the opponent to break formation first. Myth 3. Archery ended when melee began. You know, films often show archers firing just 1 or 2 volleys before making way for the infantry or cavalry to rush in. But in real battles, missile fire didn't simply stop when close combat started. In fact, the use of projectiles was often, well, continuous. The soldiers in the rear ranks of a shield wall, those who weren't directly engaged, would keep hurling whatever they could over the heads of their comrades. Spears, axes, rocks, and other thrown objects actually played a crucial role. During the Battle of Hastings, the Normans were bombarded as they advanced up the hill. Anglo-Saxon fighters threw javelins, axes, and even stones tied to wooden shafts. This kind of barrage was absolutely devastating. One eyewitness said the Norman soldiers were being crushed under the weight of flying projectiles. The Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered chronicle of the Norman conquest, shows many soldiers preparing or throwing weapons, even during the melee. These were not isolated moments. They were a regular part of the combat strategy. Throwing weapons were especially effective when aimed at the face, which was rarely well armored before the 13th century and even later remained relatively vulnerable. A stone to the face could incapacitate or kill. A thrown axe or spear could open a gap in the enemy line, something that even the front-line soldiers with handheld weapons struggled to do. Despite how crucial projectile weapons were, they are consistently underrepresented in film. Modern media tends to glorify swords and hand-to-hand combat, overlooking the strategic power of long-range attacks. But according to both archaeological evidence and written sources, missile weapons often caused as much, if not more, damage than melee weapons in a shield wall encounter. Myth 4. Cavalry could plow through infantry lines. A well-coordinated cavalry charge was certainly a frightening sight. A single horse could break ranks and knock down several men, and if even a few horsemen got through, they could wreak havoc behind enemy lines. Still, infantry weren't helpless. Even without walls, trenches, or defensive stakes, they had options. The first line of defense was missile fire. If soldiers could strike a horse before it reached their line, it might throw its rider or veer off course. But missile fire alone wasn't enough. The best counter to cavalry was mass, staying packed together tightly enough that the sheer weight and force of the group could stop a horse's momentum. The front ranks often bore the brunt of the charge, and it could be fatal for them. However, if the line held, the rest of the formation stayed intact. Sometimes, soldiers used field stakes or drove spears into the ground at an angle to impale charging horses. Long pikes, introduced more widely in later medieval warfare, were especially effective because they could be planted firmly and reach further, presenting a deadly barrier to horsemen. A classic example of this tactic was the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Scottish infantry used pikes to repel English cavalry. Contemporary accounts describe horses being impaled and men being crushed beneath their hooves, unable to rise again. Brutal, but effective. So while cavalry could be devastating, infantry that remained calm and maintained formation could blunt their impact and sometimes turn the tide of battle. Medieval shield wall warfare was far more about cohesion, timing, and collective discipline than any individual feats of strength. Despite what we often see on screen, real battles weren't chaotic, flashy, or dominated by lone heroes. They were strategic, grueling, and honestly unforgiving. If you enjoyed this breakdown of medieval warfare myths, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment with your favorite historical battle.